Good evening and a very warm welcome. I'm not just delighted, but I feel blessed to be sitting here with Jon Kolkin. He is a remarkable human being, quite apart from all the amazing things that he does. And I think that in his work and in his book, what emerges is not just, certainly in the book, what emerges is not just a remarkable series of evocative photographs that tempt you, persuade you to just keep looking at them as the many layers of its sensibility and its feelings and emotions are evoked on us. And the first thing that came into my mind was that what it must feel like to look at the Mona Lisa and just keep looking and trying to figure out what was really happening, and for the feelings and the mood that a great piece of art evokes, and capturing not just a moment of action in the traditional sense of things happening, but of things being. And so thank you, Jon, for a very important evocative piece of work. By way of a short formal introduction, I think much more will emerge about the many things that Jon is engaged with. He is a global medical volunteer. He's traveled the world and spent a lot of time in Vietnam, working to help the sort of bodies in Vietnam come alive, to use photography as an instrument of medical education. So it is not merely art for art's sake. That's not a very happy cliche, but nonetheless, the agendas of his art move far beyond an excellent photograph to helping us realize deeper layers of Buddhist values experientially, intuitively, rather than limit them to being verbalized. He's, of course, the book has won a number of awards. He's a musician, integrative medicine health coach, and some of that we will have him talk about. He's an accomplished athlete and president of the Shades of Compassion Foundation. His rare set of life experiences have made him uniquely qualified to share universally valid, science-based, practical strategies for living a more balanced, compassionate life while maintaining one's physical and mental health. And the book, Inner Harmony, Living in Balance, has a foreword by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Queen of Bhutan. And I think that's as powerful an endorsement that you can get about the more subtle, deeper qualities of the book. I'm going to request Jon. He has a PowerPoint presentation which gives us a sort of a more visual narrative of his work and his life and his aspirations, and of course, in the process, who he is. And then we'll have a conversation, and we will open it up to questions and answers and engage with you, the audience.
Well, first, thank you for the introduction, and it is an honor to be here. I'll spend about 25 minutes or so with sharing some of these things that I have on this presentation, and then we'd really like to open it up, not just for questions, but conversation. So I learn more from hearing what other people have to say than I do hearing myself talk. So feel free as we're going through this. If things come up, just think about what points you might want to raise, what questions you might have, and we'll see where we go with that. First, gratitude. And anytime you see a photograph in this presentation that has a title and a country and a year, it's one of the photographs that's in the book. Okay? There will be other photographs that I'll show also, but just keep that in mind. First, to the Foundation for Universal Responsibility for hosting this event, co-sponsored by the India International Center. Also, thank you to His Holiness, who not only did he contribute a foreword to the book, but has been very, very supportive of my work for a number of years. And his representatives, who are my dear friends, I won't go into much more detail. Her Majesty, the Queen Mother of Bhutan, who I just actually met for the first time 5 days ago in Bhutan. She was quite gracious to have me at her palace, and we had quite a wonderful conversation. It was mentioned before about our foundation, the Shades of Compassion Foundation, who has supported a lot of the work that we do around the world using art to promote compassion. And my family, you'll notice there's one person in the middle in all those photographs, regardless of who else is around. That's my first granddaughter, obviously the center of everyone's attention, and also my thanks now to the second granddaughter, who's now competing for attention. So outline of today's presentation has been thrown out the window. I will first just mention briefly my background, and then we're going to come later back to this concept of inner harmony and what's the true source of happiness, and what are some of the impediments to that. I'll also take you on one of my adventures in the Himalayas. You can see some of the places where I photograph. But what we're going to do is we're going to go first, since we switched the order, to the origin of the book and the series, the Inner Harmony series. And then I'll show you talk a little bit about the book itself. And then there's actually a museum exhibition that's at the Tibet Museum in Dharamshala right now that uses photographs from the series that is going to be coming here to the Delhi area in July. And then some conversation. So a little bit about my background. One of the hats I wear is as a physician. 20 years of volunteer work throughout the world, but first in Vietnam. Mostly throughout Southeast Asia, 24 extended stays over 25 years now throughout Asia. And most of those have been in the Himalayan region, but also other parts of Asia. The reason I bring this out is that for me, this has been an immersive process, because when I'm doing the medical work, I'm actually living in a country for a month or more typically, and I'm embedded into the community. So that's really influenced and is the reason that I came up with the book. And one of the reasons that as you look through the photographs, you'll notice, hopefully, that they don't seem like your typical tourist photographs. None of the photographs are staged in the book. It's all natural light. I have one camera, one lens. I'm living typically in a community, oftentimes in a monastery or a nunnery or some other place nearby. And after a while, they just remember me as that weird guy off in the corner. No one pays a whole lot of attention to me. And then I'm able to really see them in a more relaxed way. And that's how the photographs really come about. I've used, as was mentioned, photography as an educational tool in medicine, and that's really kind of, maybe you'll see some consistency in the kind of photographs you see in the book. In medicine, we use photographs to help in communicating. And in order to do that, number one, you don't have a lot of time when you were there with a patient. You can't just sit there and set everything up formally and start taking a bunch of photographs. So you have to be focused, you have to be thinking ahead of time, what is it that I want to communicate, and then very clearly in the photograph, communicate what it is that I want to say. Because oftentimes when I'm in another country, I'm communicating using English. They may or may not understand English completely. I have a interpreter, a translator there also that's helping. But in medicine, you've got to be extremely clear about what you're saying, because if it gets misinterpreted, then, as you can imagine, things can go wrong. So with years and years of practice in medicine doing that, it's really hopefully helped me so that I can communicate with the photographs. So I also use photography because of my medical background as an art form for helping foster well-being. So this series in the book is all about trying to do that, okay, which I'll talk about in a minute. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to skip forward real quickly, and I hope I can do this without too much of a hassle. I'm going to jump to the series, and then we'll come back to this other part. Okay, so here we go. All right, I think we're getting closer. All right. So let me take you on an adventure in the Himalayas, because this will give you some idea of the situation I'm in when I'm photographing. This was in the country of Bhutan, which all of you know, and my medical work is in Thimphu at the National Hospital there in the valley. The valley's at about 8,000 feet, and computing that to, meters, 2.5, 2,500 something, whatever meters. And then at the top of the mountain there, that's up at around 15,000 feet. Okay, so that's about 4,500 meters up. So where I'm going to be taking you is up to the top of the mountain. And because I'm there as a volunteer, I'm not there as a tourist, I can go in different places without a tour guide. In this particular case, I actually did take a guide because I'd never been to this one remote temple before. So this is on the way up. This is going up, and you can see the white prayer flags on the sides of the hill, which I'm sure most of you know signify someone who has passed, the white flags. These are steep trails going up. And my favorite place in the world is the Phajiding Monastery. It's about 12,000 feet up. I've been there a number of times, and there's only one chapter in the whole book of 18 chapters that's actually about a physical location, and it's about the Phajiding Monastery. These are boys that come from troubled backgrounds, and the head Lama is an extremely compassionate individual, and the way he helps these children grow is just phenomenal. So there's only one chapter, you can read more about that in the book that actually talks about them. So I usually overnight there when I'm going in further areas further up the mountain. Now we're getting up, I'm going up to the top of the mountain, and you can see I'm in the clouds there. Those are the prayer flags, and the wind is howling. We're at about 15,000 feet now. It's getting really cold. I'm all wrapped up in everything, and it's getting late, and we're really dog tired at this point. The sun's gone down, and it's getting really dark, and we didn't know exactly where we were till we saw these prayer flags, and then we knew that we were close to this one little temple that's up in this remote area. The temple, there's only one caretaker there. He's a monk that's been there for 12 years. It's a very old temple. This is a prayer wheel. The temple is like a few hundred years old. You can see steam coming off of his breath here, and we're all warming up by the fire. He was very kind enough to pour us some tea, and then doma. I don't know how many of you are familiar with doma, but doma is something they chew, and it's like caffeine times 20. Apparently, I've not tried chewing it. I politely declined. He cooked us a very nice meal, and then we bedded down where the altar was. This is my guide who's just exhausted. We went to sleep that night. It was extremely quiet that night. When I woke up in the morning, one of the reasons I realized that it was so quiet is that it had snowed the night before. You can see we're up above the clouds, okay? So we're really up there high, but it's just a remarkable experience. He was doing his morning prayers and allowed me to photograph. And then it was time for us to go along the high pass and then go down in the valley. He said, "Oh, I know a good way down the valley. There's a yak trail we can go down." So I said, "Okay, let's go." So we head along and we get to this forest. Well, he couldn't find the yak trail. So here we are at the top of this mountain at 15,000 feet, trying to figure our way down the mountain. We went just stumbling through the forest for quite a while. Finally came across the yak herders' encampment. There's a little boy peeking out from the tent. And of course, as you can imagine, there are yaks. So just pay attention to this curly-haired fellow. They're really big. And one of the things working at the hospital that you realize is that there are certain injuries that occur in Bhutan. One of them is getting hit by an arrow because archery is their national sport. Another is getting mauled by the bear, but the third is getting gored by a yak. So you want to be really careful when you're around a yak. So the physician part of me knows that, okay, right? But the photographer side of me is a total idiot. So they're pushing the yaks down the mountain there. So what do? I take out my camera. There's the curly-haired fella to my right, and they're charging toward me. Well, fortunately, he ran off to my right side. The other one, I guess, went off to my left because I didn't get gored, and I survived. So that's one of my typical experiences taking photographs. So let's then get to the book itself and the series, the Inner Harmony series, where the book comes from. So here's the Inner Harmony photographic series. It started with a trip to China in 2012. And the photographs in the book come from that same series. The objective of the series is to use intimate photographs of devout Buddhists from throughout Southeast Asia to explore universally relevant principles central to living a balanced life and achieving true happiness, regardless of one's spiritual beliefs. Okay, so these are universal concepts. I'm just using Buddhism as a way of springboard for conversation and opening the minds, hopefully, particularly some Westerners, to some of these other concepts and other ways of thinking. So again, the photographs were all taken throughout Southeast Asia during 17 extended stays over 13 years, mostly in the Himalayas, and also in eight other times in 7 other countries. The series has been exhibited in multiple galleries throughout the United States, museums throughout the United States, also with the help of the India International Center and the Foundation and others, has actually been exhibited here throughout India and Bhutan. The photographic series has received over 20 international photography awards, and I really didn't have any thoughts of doing a book. But during my first private audience with His Holiness, we were sitting and talking, and we were holding hands. And one of the things he asked was whether I would join in promoting compassion worldwide. I still didn't have any idea of doing a book at that time. That was in 2017, but we formed our foundation. The Shades of Compassion Foundation have been doing a number of projects around the world related to that. At that time, I just had a book that I self-published, 50 copies, called Inner Harmony, Learning from the Buddhist Spirit. So I brought it along because I was thinking, I'm going to give this to His Holiness as a gift. You know, everything was going great. We were having a great time and everything. We were having a wonderful conversation. So I hand him the book. And what does he say? He says, Dr. John, he calls me Dr. John. He says, Dr. John, you can't call it Learning from the Buddhist Spirit. Everybody's going to think you want to convert them to Buddhism, which wasn't my idea at all. It was just simply to use that as a way of an introduction for Westerners about other ways of thinking. So this is the book, and despite all that, I was a little taken aback, but I understood what he was saying, and he was kind enough to give myself and our mayor gifts also. So at that point, I didn't have any idea of doing a book, but then in 2021, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Ansel Adams. Many of you know he's known as the world's leading photographer of all time. He's deceased now. Well, someone who had worked on Ansel Adams' first and most published book approached me out of the blue and said, "We've seen your work, we would like to do a book." I'd say, well, gosh, I hadn't thought of that, but maybe if we can do it and somehow relate it to the concept of light, balance, and compassion, we can go ahead and do that. So this person connected me with Lance Heide, who designed 14 of Ansel Adams' books. And Lance Heide agreed to do this with me, so we were off to the races. He did an extraordinary job with the designing the book and putting everything together. And when I first met the Dalai Lama back in 2000, well, no, it was before I met the Dalai Lama, but when I was in Dharamshala, I met someone who is a PhD Buddhist scholar from California named Dr. Paula Arai. She's a superb poet and also great at editing prose. So we also brought her into the picture. So each chapter, this is chapter 4, it's about compassion for animals. Each chapter has a poem that she wrote, and then I also have in each chapter something where I talk about some concept of one of my experiences, and then she helped edit the prose. As I said, there are 18 chapters, and each chapter talks about one of the building blocks to living a balanced life. Some are related to wisdom, some are compassion for self. The list goes on and on. For those that aren't familiar with some of the terms that are used, there's also a glossary in the back. We brought the book to 10 of the world's leading publishers of fine art photography books, and we're extremely fortunate and shocked that Toulouse out of Germany picked up the book and wanted to do it. They're extremely careful about how to print a photograph in a book. So if any of you have had a chance to look at the book, or if you haven't yet, you could go outside and see it. You can see what a superb job they did with the printing of the book and the editing. It's hardcover, bilingual. Most of the photographs are black and white, and I get asked frequently, why are most of your photographs in the series in black and white? Well, the reason is that for me anyway, when I see something in color, I tend to get attracted to the color. I love the colors of what you're wearing right there. Beautiful. But what I want to really focus on and communicate with people is what's going on the inside. What's the emotion that's going on the inside? Not how do we look on the outside, but what's going on the inside. So that's why my photographs, and when I do exhibitions in museums, are in black and white. But Toulouse is famous for their color photography. So they asked me, please, can you please have about 20 photographs in color? So that's why in the book, you'll see some color photographs. As mentioned before, His Holiness was extremely generous by including a foreword in the book, and also the Queen Mother of Bhutan. The book is dedicated to all the incredible people throughout Asia that I've had the honor of being around for the last 25 years. And because of the work of Lance and others, the book has received 3 international photography book awards. Any receipts that I get related to the book, half of it goes to C-Learning, social, emotional, and ethical learning, which many of you may be familiar with. It's very big here in India, supported by the Max India Foundation and Emory University. It teaches compassion to children worldwide in the classroom for free. The other half of the money goes to the Tariana Foundation, which does microfinance grants to empower disadvantaged women. As I mentioned, there's an exhibition that's now at the Tibet Museum in Dharamshala called A Sacred Path, Seeking True Happiness. Its objective is to show the relationship between Mahayana Buddhist daily practices and universally relevant 6-step process for achieving greater happiness when dealing with our life's challenges. We all have challenges in our lives. No one's immune. And the key is, how can we navigate through that in a healthy way? And that's where my medical background and what I've learned from speaking with different people and some of the world's leaders in science of how the mind works and the heart works and how to do that. So the exhibition is there at the museum now through May 31st. These were some monks from a local monastery that were kind enough to come and do a sand mandala. And you can see some of the photographs are created as Thangka paintings. I brought some of the palladium prints to Bhutan and had a tailor make them into the style of a Thangka. And the again, different sections of the exhibition talk about some of these different building blocks, step 1 to step 6. The exhibition next goes to the Museo Camera nearby to here in Gurugram, and that'll be end of June to the middle of July. So that's really it. If anyone wants to get in touch with me for any reason, feel free to do so through the Shades of Compassion Foundation or through my own website for my photography. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very, very much for being here, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, John. That's a wonderful introduction to the book and its aspirations and its methodology and approach. We really are here to learn from you about what it takes for someone like you, with so many diverse interests, passions, and commitments, to develop and execute, develop the sensibility, nurture that sensibility, to respond to moments and images that tell such rich, layered stories. And I mean, amongst the other things I know that you do is that you, as you've said, that you use a single lens. What lens is it?
It's working, yeah. So I've used a lens that goes from about 24 to 110. And it really doesn't, the equipment doesn't matter so much. I tell this to people all the time. I just did a 2-day photography workshop in Bhutan for the community service organizations. And people were asking me, well, what's your equipment? It really doesn't matter so much. All the cameras are really great these days. There are certain reasons why I use the particular one that I use, but I've used a Canon, I've used a Sony. You know, it really doesn't matter.
I'll just throw a few questions, combine them for you. That amongst the things that makes these moments possible, for example, is you wear dark clothes so that you can sort of merge into the background. You're not really present, and yet you're present in many ways, even in your photographs. I mean, your presence is there in the photographs, though we don't see you. It also is, the technical aspect, where, of course, technology is now, how to put it, makes the moment and the image far more accessible to filmmakers than it did in the past, because digital technology means you can shoot in low light, you have faster lenses, and what have you. But ultimately, as you rightly pointed out, it's capturing the moment, capturing the texture, and when you mentioned the publisher, that when the photograph is printed, the contrast, the layers, the textures, how the nuance of the image is reproduced. Often something that only a photographer's eye sees when it's being captured, but now with the technology that's available, that can be modified too. So these are sort of series of things. Just give us a sense of all the magic, in a sense, that goes into creating the photographs that you do.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And in some ways it goes back to your earlier comment about my somewhat unusual background. So as I mentioned, one of the hats that I wear is a physician. But one of the things that's helped me throughout my life has been to follow my passions, to follow my instincts. So that goes also into photography. I don't photograph what I've seen somebody else photograph. I follow my heart mind, sita in Sanskrit, to decide what to do. So as an example, you had mentioned before that I'm an athlete. I never looked at myself as having to be part of the group that were all the jocks, okay? same time a musician. I was selected as a member of the American Youth Symphony. We did a 10-country European concert tour. But I was never thought of myself as I'm that group or academic. It's always been not trying to fit into someone else's perception of what I am, but to be myself. And that, I think, has served me well in just following my instincts. And actually, which is a whole other story, the way I got into medical school was because of my music background. The way I got into my residency was the attending physician who was interviewing me at where I was going, looked at my folder and my resume. As soon as he saw that I was a member of the American Youth Symphony, he threw down the folder. He didn't want to ask me any questions. He put his feet up on his desk, turned down the lights. We turned on classical music. We listened to classical music the whole time. And that's how I got into my residency. So my point is that with photography, I just follow my instincts. And if a photograph isn't exciting me, I know when I'm there and I'm in a situation where there's some real potential. And it may be that the photograph I want to take is around from that angle over there. So I'm mentally flying from here over to there and seeing the photograph from that angle, which gets back to my medical background doing surgery. I have to visualize when I'm examining a patient what's going on the inside of the body without my being able to see it. And then how do I get to that location to then help in whatever the problem might be? So it's a three-dimensional way of looking at the world and following instincts. And then if I'm getting in there and I'm finding something different, not to let my ego get in the way, but to see what's really there and to adjust. So it's the same thing with the photography. If I'm doing something and I think there's something really great here, I need to stay focused on that, but at the same time, I need to be aware that, oh, there might be something even better from a different angle. So all these things play together, and that's that balance between following the heart and following the academic mind, and finding that where there's a synergy between the two. It can't be all one or the other.
That's a very interesting perspective, because what you're really saying in Buddhist terms is to put aside the self and surrender to the moment, to the unfolding moment. So you put aside the self, and the rest flows.
Exactly, yeah.
So I just want to jump, because we only have that much time, so hop, skip, jump, is that the photography embodies the whole idea of evoking. I don't want to say communicating, because I think it goes beyond just demonstrating compassion to evoking feelings. So you're looking at a visual vocabulary that is evocative, and yet you're going through a process where you're putting yourself aside. And so obviously what is happening is that and that's what I was alluding to when I said that in the photographs we see you from the vantage point of where you're capturing the image. But there is the obstacle or the aid or whatever we want to say, however we want to describe it, of the process. There is technology, there is a manner in which the pixels of the camera read the image, there is a particular way in which they reproduce, and also that how you mentally shut out the color and see the black and white. That process happens. So how is that acquired? I can understand that the sensibility is an expression of who you are. But there is that aspect that has to be so deeply and profoundly internalized that it's a reflex.
Yeah, and all I can do is speak for myself, and there's some things, we all have this experience, where there's some things that are fairly obvious to you, and you just assume other people are seeing that also or feeling that. And then the more you get into conversations with people, you realize that no, everybody doesn't see things the same way or the same way that I'm seeing things. So for me, a lot of it's just instinct. It's just there, but it's also just being immersed in the process so that I'm not distracted from other things, and being very respectful of the environment and of the people and of the animals, and appreciating it and just being immersed in it. That's what's key for me. It has to be an authentic experience. And then I'm just trying the best I can to capture that and then communicate that. But then also, I'm always fascinated by different things that other people see in one of my images, whether it's at a museum exhibition or something they see in the book. So again, everybody has their own ways of seeing things and multiple ways of seeing the same thing. And I think all that plays into it.
So does the photograph ever surprise you?
Absolutely. Because again, when I go back and look at a photograph over again, I see things that I didn't see before. And I think the idea with the book is that it's an immersive experience. So one example is the cover of the book. This is a boy in beer in India at a monastery. They were having a puja ceremony that was just getting ready to start. They were all lining up. The day before, we were all horsing around. They were playing cricket. They were rolling around on the ground. So he already knew me, okay? But when I took this photograph, I was extremely excited about it right off the bat. But the first photograph, the other monk's hand was not on his head. And then the monk just put his hand on his head, and I took this next photograph. Having grandchildren, having had children, the concept of holding them holding my finger, I connected to that right away. But what I didn't understand, what I didn't connect with, was the concept of the heart mind that His Holiness talks about, Sito, that I was, and so with the hand on his head, which you all know is a sacred part of the body, and only a close family member would dare to put their hand on the head of a young child. Okay, and another hand over his heart. That's the heart mind, number one. Number two is the concept of how do we define family. So I was with one of the senior monks. He invited me to his private quarters, and I naively asked him about his family, and after a while it became clear to me he was talking about the monks that raised him from age 6 also, not about his biological family. So this photograph for me is very significant in that it signifies to me, how do we define family? And the concept of endless knot, and we're all interconnected, whether we like it or not. And also, there may be some members of your biological family that you don't get along too well with. You can be kind to them, but that's not the extent of your family, and you can go beyond that. And there's a real value in doing that. So my point is that this photograph took on more and more layers over time, and I learned by listening to other people.
I think that the we'll just sort of nudge along to one of your other many diverse facets, and that is that you through conscious practice nurture this idea of compassion through the techniques and processes of Buddhism, and as His Holiness often said, there is no singular technique. It depends on our mental disposition and what kind of mental diet we need. So the question really is, what was your mental diet? It seems to me from the outside that it was all the things that you were doing. You're going to Vietnam, and how many people would want to go into Vietnam and start taking photographs so that it could help others treat patients? So that these values and ideas then get reflected in your work. And the Dalai Lama says, why don't you do something on compassion? And it goes click, 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 and you're on your way. Right. Tell us about the process.
Yeah, well, first of all, so back when I was growing up, they didn't know what dyslexia was, but I am dyslexic. I had to have a special tutor to help me learn to read. You might ask, well, how in the world did you get through medical school? Well, fortunately, one of my classmates was really a good note taker, and a lot of us paid to have her notes so that I could focus on what was all going on up on the screen, so I didn't have to sit there writing. So I'm not a reader, I'm not a writer. So my academic experience is basically visual. Most of us are visual learners. 60% are visual learners, and the academic systems in general don't take that into consideration and expect you to look at the blackboard and read all these things. And for a lot of us, that's not exactly the best way to go. So I'm not academic, and so what I've picked up has been through observation, through keeping my mouth closed and watching, listening, and whatnot. So that's kind of my process, and that's been my process my whole life. One of the things that I learned early on was leverage your skills and get help where you need help. So for me to learn another language would be totally futile. So I always make sure I have a good translator with me wherever I go in the world. So that's another skill that you might want to consider. Don't let your ego get in the way. Just accept some of the reality and get help where you need it and leverage your skills.
You are also, in a sense, a trainer. And give us a 101 of the techniques and practices that would enable us to become more compassionate. I mean, there is, of course, the formal, structured Buddhist approach, but I think, as His Holiness was saying to you, that this is not about Buddhism per se. It's a much larger human canvas, and hence the idea of secular values and secular mind training. So give us a sense of your approach.
Well, I think the first thing is to not take myself too seriously. His Holiness, if you've been around him, he's joking all the time. And I say this in a respectful way, he doesn't take himself he considers himself a simple monk, okay? So there are, as we all know, there are what are known as the destructive negative emotions. Greed, anger, okay, envy, those are, and ego, okay, those are the big ones. And I've never taken myself so seriously. I'm just shocked when people talk about, John's done this, that, I'm just being me. So I think that's helped me quite a bit, just not taking myself too seriously. We all, get up in the morning, we all have to brush our teeth, we all have to put on clothes, we all have to go to bed, and we have to get some sleep at night. We're all the same, we really are. The external superficial is just superficial. So keeping my head on straight, I think, maybe has helped me somewhat. And so once you start with that and you respect everyone, then you're more than halfway there. Just look at people as a human being. So one of the things I was fortunate enough to spearhead a summit of museum professionals from North America to come to India and have a summit on compassion in a private audience with His Holiness. And one of the things that we did was we paired up and we stood this close to each other and looked in each other's eyes for 3 minutes straight. Couldn't move away, had to look in the eyes. And when you just look in someone's eyes and you focus in on that, you see the humanity in everyone. You see the humanity in everyone. And you can also do that if you have a pet animal, a dog or something like that. So once you get past that surface and all the pretentiousness and just look and sense that other individual, then I think that can really help bring us along that compassionate path.
His Holiness often says that if, to deal with our egos, if we just think of ourselves, of all the wonderful food we seek and we eat and we relish as it moves through our tactile tongues and mouths, and what comes out at the end of it. And if you reflect on that, it really reminds us that we're just a machine or a system that converts delicious-looking food into fecal matter. And that and also, as you said, that it is also the strength of the tradition is that it has these secular methods, such as taking on the suffering of others, the visualization process, as that when when you're in pain, the natural reflux is to sort of distract yourself from it and not to think about pain. And of course, the contemporary version in terms of mindfulness is to become deeply aware of the pain. But interestingly, His Holiness's methods and of the Mahayana tradition are not too clued into the idea of mindfulness. They really see it as a preliminary to a much deeper practice, where you then look at someone else's greater pain and make that your own. And so I think that the genius of the Buddhist tradition has been the combination of method and wisdom. So it's not just the wisdom aspect. And so the challenge really is that we see that, or we recognize theoretically that we shouldn't have ego, but then how do we achieve that? What are the methodologies of doing that, of not taking oneself seriously? So to be able to identify the elements that make it possible for us, this is where neuroplasticity comes in, and I want to have you touch on neuroplasticity a little bit, is that we can actually change the structure of the brain so that we stop thinking the way we do. And that's pretty dramatic.
Yeah, and so neuroplasticity, for those of you that are familiar with that, that's the concept that our brain's structure can actually change, and this is regardless of age, by practicing something repetitively. Now, it could be a negative thing we practice or a positive thing, but what actually happens is, so I won't get into too much of it, but there are clusters of neurons and there are channels between them, like highways, and the axons or the connectors, but there's myelin that's wrapped around it. The myelin speeds up the conductivity, and by changing the way we're thinking, we can atrophy the myelin for one pathway and actually hypertrophy or increase the amount of myelin for another pathway. And this can be done with practice. That's the whole idea. Everything is about of repetition practice. I will say one thing, and this is going to be a bit controversial, so I'll say this right from the beginning. There's a reason why the name of the book is Inner Harmony, Living in Balance. The original term dukkha, which is translated most often into English as suffering, actually, if you look back, there are different translations of it. And sukha means ease. Dukkha means non-ease. Or some people look at that as out of balance or out of alignment. The concept may have been that the wheels of an ox cart being out of alignment. So the reason I bring that up, and this is from the psychology of it and the neuroscientists that I've spoken with, when we think and look at everyone else's suffering, that over time can be exhausting. And we're bombarded with the news media about the suffering. And what the science is showing, and Dr. Singer in Germany is one of them, but showing that if we're constantly bombarded with the suffering of others, what happens is it increases the incidence of depression, PTSD, social withdrawal, and empathic distress. However, if we look at it as imbalance, which is not as harsh of a term, then I can relate to the fact that we're all out of balance. And I don't necessarily have to feel pity for you that you're suffering. I can relate more easily to you being out of balance. So the whole idea is that we're going to have our fluctuations in our emotions up and down, but there's the resiliency zone that's talked about at Emory. And as long as we're within that zone, that's a healthy zone. But when we get way out of it, that's when we get to the suffering part. So the idea is we're out of balance, but we can stay into a more balanced state if we really focus on it. Now, it's true that with Tonglen, you actually intentionally take on the suffering of others, but there's a key difference. When doing that, it's important to be under the supervision of someone who's an expert. And it's a long-term process to learn Tonglen. Whereas if you're just exposed to suffering and don't have the skill set, the tools to manage it in a healthy way, that's when we get into depression, that's when we get into PTSD and all the other problems. So I know suffering is the term that's used, and I can understand why, but I do have a little nuanced difference of opinion about what the true translation is of dukkha and why, from a medical perspective, it's important to make that distinction.
Well, I know that the monks in Dharamsala and His Holiness himself have been deeply anguished by the first generation of translators who came and translated Buddhist terms. I mean, shunya isn't really emptiness, or even empty of inherent existence. And so these things have led to a lot of hardship for practitioners and students who have followed. We have about 10-15 minutes, so if I may just sort of open this up to questions. Sir?
I have seen your beautiful, captivating photographs, and which reflect harmony as well as balance. But the question which is still in my mind, whether this external experience and the inner harmony necessarily do they merge together, or this is something which becomes a paradox by itself? The experience and evoking experience which Rajiv has just now said, how you reintegrate the evocation and the experience with the inner harmony and inner balance. Thank you.
Excellent question. So for science, sociology studies show us that external balance or happiness, there are 5 or so key elements that are necessary for that. And this is regardless of someone's economic level or whatever, unless you're extremely poor or wealthy. But 1 is shelter, a roof over our head. 2 is enough food to eat. 3 is palatable water. 4 is a safe environment to live in. And number 5 is community. Those are the external things that we all need in order to live in harmony. Okay, that's what the sociology studies show. Then we switch to the internal. What are the internal qualities that are necessary? Okay, one that's kind of between external and internal is maintaining good physical health, proper sleep, proper exercise, proper diet, that sort of thing. Then we get to the internal. The reality is that we all face challenges throughout our lives. And there will be things that happen to us or in our environment that we didn't have any control over. What we do have is a choice in how we're going to respond. Choice. That's where the choosing is. And I see this in patients, where patients have the exact same diagnosis. One of them is like the end of the world and everything's falling apart. The other person says, oh my gosh, I'm so pleased that at least we found out what the problem is, and at least there's something they can do to help me a little bit with this problem. Exact same external condition, but the internal mindset has changed, which gets back to what we were just talking about training the mind in how to process things in a healthy way.
Does anyone else have a question? Ma'am.
Way to say that you do have to read and write. And and then you are doing medical practices. Now, in the ancient hundreds of years ago in India, we also had this oral tradition where they didn't have to read and write, but they had an oral tradition which passed on in the generations. So do you see a parallel there, that you go back to the ancient, what India was, and you're bringing about that tradition here, that you don't have to read and write, you can do medical practice if you know what you're focused on?
So when I gave a presentation in every university, it's called Creativity Conversation, and one of the other people that was giving a presentation was a Tibetan physician. And after everything was over, I went and he and I had a conversation, and I asked him, of all the different tools that you use, all the diagnostic things that you do and whatever, checking the pulse and looking at the urine, what's the one thing that you find is most valuable to you? Listen to the patient. Same thing in Western medicine. You have to listen to the patient. You have to listen. So my point is that when I've worked in Africa, there are traditional doctors there. And people believe in the things that they can do, and some of the things they can do can help. There's no one right answer. My professors, when I was in medical school, most of the time they had some really smart things to say, but if I just listened to them, not good. I had to keep open to see what was I observing in the real world. And when the red flags go up that something wasn't jiving, I had to rethink. So it wasn't just what I read in a textbook. It had to be observing in real time and being focused, just as I do with the photography. You have to be present, have to be focused.
You know, there was a very interesting a nuance to the question that you asked about the oral tradition and why the value of the oral tradition, not merely verbalizing it. So long before the written word, you know, in the Vedic tradition, that the whole idea of the Sanskrit language was in poetry, sort of omanopitya, is that the right word? Where the sound of the word has a resonance, and that's sort of the origin of, in a sense, of mantra. So the Sanskrit language evolved out of an approximation of the sound that represented the object or the reality or the idea that the word represented. And not widely known is the Sanskrit language was thus frozen, because that it was when Brahmanism began the idea of rituals and using the words, the accuracy which they were articulated was crucial to the mind state they evoked, or the understanding that they evoked because of that. So in some senses, when it began to be written down, that element was lost. So even now, it's like listening to a teacher is different to reading what the teacher said, because the word is carrying something, its sound, its texture, and even in Buddhist terms, the motivation behind that communication is saying something. Just like in Jon's work, not in the same way, but his images are speaking to us because of who he is. And often I have this, as a sort of aspiring filmmaker, this idea that only a good person produce a great work of art. That element of integrity, of purity, or whatever it is. So I think that is the exciting aspect of sound, of Sanskrit in particular. Not why did and the corollary to that, just as an insight of our interest in Buddhism, is that what really happened when Buddhism traveled from India to Tibet, it didn't travel through the scriptures. as, Islam and Christianity, the Bible traveled and the teachings traveled. It was the teachers from India who were invited by the kings of Tibet to travel to Tibet and to teach, so that the experience was non-conceptual. So his experience when he's visualizing a photograph is non-conceptual. So they were teaching both the gyan, the wisdom, which was in the scriptures, but the method by which you could experience that, because any attempt to conceptually communicate that would be inadequate. Because you and I often use this example, I can't tell you what coffee tastes like unless you've tasted it. And are we going to talk about subtle mental states and verbalize them? So the photograph is one, I would say a lesser but an important instrument of communicating that. So what happened is that when it traveled to Tibet, the Tibetans, in order to preserve it, uniquely expanded their vocabulary to accommodate the diversity of experiences. And so today we're struggling with, what is the English equivalent of dukkha? What is the English equivalent of shunya? There cannot be, because there's no approximation in the Western vocabulary to what it is. So we struggle with words, we use juxtaposition of words. And so when the Buddha came out of from underneath the Bodhi tree, he reflected deeply on what he should do. He said, how can I explain what I have experienced? And so he not merely saw the true nature of reality, he experienced the true nature of reality. And that's all it's about. That once we experience the true nature of reality, and we look at interrelatedness, and we look at interdependence, and we look at impermanence, all the things that John's work evokes. So that's it. Then he decided that he would sort of come up with a few principles that could be communicated, and then he would teach his disciples how they could experience it. So that's just sort of, to give you a sense of what John's work is trying to achieve in today's sort of environment and context. And amongst its many achievements is that though it is located in a particular social and dare I say, I don't want to use the word religion for Buddhism, Buddhist context, these are universal reflexes and insights that he is seeking to evoke. And then he's using, in his book, along with the images, he's using poetry. Also, not to be literally read. What makes a great poem is what it evokes in you. It's trying to transcend the potential of the word or a traditional sentence. And his descriptions, his stories, his narratives, to communicate to you through diverse elements the experience he has experienced. Sorry if I went off on a tangent.
One of the main reasons that we had the poetry in there and the written word is because I know that some people learn through poetry. I don't particularly, but other people do. But I thought it was important to do that. And anytime I have an exhibition of my work, it's always a multisensory interactive experience. It's not just the photographs. There are multiple other elements to it, even background music, very, very soft. And talking about the music part, when you hear the horns, blaring and whatnot during a puja, there's a frequency there, and it's an intentional frequency. They don't necessarily have known that or scientifically looked at it, but that particular frequency evokes something within us, within our soul or whatever. Just like meditation, there's a rhythm of breathing, or people are instructed to do, where there's actually, from a scientific perspective, that goes along with the rhythm of our being. It's not just by chance. So these things that were not written down initially and are now being instructed, we're just part of our Buddha nature.
Final question.
I'm practicing meditative film studies person. So my these two biases are creeping into my question. So I look at your photograph, and it indicates a certain stasis, and that sometimes bothers me. And then I think about reality as impermanence but continuous, and the photograph just arrests that. It is a moment, but it is a moment that you've arrested. And while I am a great admirer of black and white photography, life is in color, right? So, but you've given it a stylization in black and white. And that makes me wonder, have you gotten to the essence of that moment in black and white to not be distracted by color? Or is it that you've bleached that moment of color to get to that, like the ultimate truth of that moment of stasis? I don't have a question, just thoughts.
Well, actually, it brings up a really excellent point. We have an exhibition, our Shades of Compassion Foundation has an exhibition that just opened last week at a museum in Lexington, Kentucky, the Healy Whitman Museum. And it's 50 photographs. We got an independent curator from the West Coast to put together 50 photographs that she selected from around the world of some of the world's leading photographers on the concept of compassion. And when one person looks at a photograph, there's one where a woman is partially submerged in water. And for most people, it's a very soothing photograph. But some people come from a background where they associate water and being partially submerged with death or a traumatic experience. So for that person, that photograph that's soothing to one is very distressful to another. My point is that what you're experiencing is an experience that other people have, while at the same time, other people look at it in a very different way or halfway in between. So the photographs are not intended to say a final story. They're just one of the many potential chapters of the ways of interpreting things. If anyone goes to my website, you'll see that there are other series, almost all the series, are in color. So it really depends on what it is that I'm trying to communicate, and some of those other series are of people, but they're in color. So it really depends on what it is that I'm personally trying to communicate through a particular series. But it's not one shoe fits all. So I honor and respect your way of looking at those photographs and seeing something in it that for you would be improved or you would get more out of if they were in color. And that's great. That's wonderful. That's the whole idea, is to get people to think about it, to focus on it, and what is it that I'm seeing? What's moving me? What's not moving me? What could make it better for me? How do I take this and move it forward in a positive way for me? So that's really great, and I really appreciate you bringing up that point.
There was another point on that. Stasis. Of freezing a moment.
Oh, freezing.
Stasis,
Oh,
sorry.
so, I'm sorry, thank you for reminding me about that. The reality of still photography is that it is freezing a moment from my perspective. I am not astute or skilled at videography. I just came from Bhutan, and I was at a community CSO, a community service organization that takes care of disabled children. And I was photographing all morning there. We're actually going to pair them with another organization that takes care of animals. And there's a lot of science that bringing animals and humans together can be good for both. But what I did was after that, I met with two people, a brother and sister, one who loves still photography, the other who loves videography. And our plan is to go back and use both video and still, so we have different ways of communicating what's going on. So there's a value in still sometimes, there's a value in video sometimes, and there's not just one way to do things.
And philosophically, it's all a series of moments. And the film, and in the days of film at 25 frames a second, so it was 25 moments that made up a second. And again, as I think Jon was saying, both with black and white and color, photography started off as being black and white. And even today, black and white photography is more challenging than color. And in a way, it gives the mind an opportunity to be more interpretive than color is. And there he is. I mean, sort of working with the diversity of possibilities, depending on the level of ambiguity or clarity, or how much he wants to challenge himself and his audience. You can say something literally, you can say something evocatively, and I mean, there's a whole range of, he wants to trigger your imagination so that you're seeing beyond what you see. And in his case, his aspiration is that you feel beyond what you see. And I think this for a true artist, these are the options they are able to exercise. I mean, people like Picasso and many of the great artists, not just painters, were using so many different forms and techniques precisely because they wanted to communicate a range of experiences and insights that a single form didn't allow you to do. So thank you very much, Jon. This has been a most illuminating evening, and we look forward to the next cycle of your work, and that it doesn't take as long as you did this time, and that we can welcome you back to the India International Center. Thank you very much.